terminated.
Don't worry. I've been reprogrammed and sent back from the future with an urgent message. This may be the most important intel you have ever received. This franchise needs to stop.
No.
Yeah, I'm sorry, John, but if you only knew how many different actors would end up playing you over the course of this film series, you will end up being the least recognizable pop culture hero in history. Sarah, think of your son. You know what's going to happen to him in the name of keeping this thing going. Mr. T-800, Uncle Bob, whatever you call yourself, you're from the future too. Am I wrong?
No.
So then, for the sake of your legacy, it has to end here. Say it with me. It has to end here. Certain movies can come to define their decades. The 70s had Star Wars, the 90s had Pulp Fiction. I would say that the original Terminator just might be the quintessential 80s movie, presenting a world of superficial cheeriness that sits atop a dark, pervasive fear of death by nuclear war. One wonders if the visual and stylistic excesses of the decade were overcompensating for the ugliness brewing out there in the broader world, with the Cold War entering its final stages and the threat of a much hotter war lurking in the back of everyone's mind. The Terminator managed to both embrace that darkness and yet remain hopeful with its message that any of us, however mundane our lives might seem, could turn out to be the stuff of future history books and stronger than we ever believed of ourselves.
On your feet, soldier! On your feet!
It was a modest box office hit upon release, but really came into its own with the burgeoning home video market. Like Star Wars before it, once it was here to stay.
It'll never be over, will it?
It's managed to drag itself right up to 2019 with the most recent in a series of sequels, though original director James Cameron considered the story to have finished with Part 2. Anyone who's stuck with the series after that has been probably asking themselves the same question I have all these years. Why is this so hard? Time has yet to produce the Terminator sequel I've wanted to see since the original debuted, and after the catastrophic underperforming of the most recent installment, it may never happen at all. For some reason, this franchise has had the damnedest time in continuing to justify its existence by writing sequels that are either a retread of the original or just turning the continuity into the stuff of nightmares. When Terminator 2 was released, I was somewhat surprised. I was expecting it to be mostly this. Instead, it largely copied the approach of the first film, with two time travelers coming back from the future to fight over the eventual savior of the human race. The film ended up being so good that I didn't really mind the repetition all that much, and the Sarah-John Terminator dynamic was so new and different that the film did really present something new. Any or all of these three leads could have been said to have been the hero of the piece, as they all go through a journey during the course of the film. The effects were stunning at the time and largely still hold up, and the emotional core of the film held it together, even as the post-Cold War environment made its dire warnings of nuclear apocalypse feel less immediate and terrifying than they had back in '84. But already, one of the problems that would dog this franchise throughout its existence was already rearing its head. Time. Not time simply in terms of time travel, though that would also become a factor, but in simpler matters such as John's age. This scene indicates he's supposed to be 10. Edward Furlong was 13 at the time of filming and looked every month of it. It would have been a simple matter to just set the film in early 1997. With Judgment Day mere months away, Sarah's increasing desperation to escape would have made perfect sense. Other time-related issues included the fact that Miles Dyson was identified as the man most responsible for the creation of Skynet, yet we see he does this by researching the chip from the original Terminator, which technically means that no one ever actually invented this technology. It just sort of sprang into existence. The first film's claim that only living tissue or things surrounded by it could time travel was tossed right out the window by inventing the T-1000, a shape-shifting blob of liquid metal with nothing organic about it. Though perhaps the biggest problem is the claim by Kyle Reese that
Connor sent me to intercept and they blew the whole place. Nobody else comes through.
a point which every subsequent sequel would completely ignore. Now, the first cut of T2 actually had a completely closed-off ending with the war totally averted, but this was ultimately dropped in favor of a more ambiguous ending. Still, it was a pretty satisfying conclusion to the story, and it stayed that way for 12 years until 2003 when Rise of the Machines came along and started to make those problems harder to ignore.
My name is John Connor. They tried to murder me before I was born. When I was 13, they tried again.
Granted, you looked it, along with looking a great deal more like Edward Furlong, but Part 2 gave your age as 10. That's clunky enough continuity in its own right, but it creates an even bigger and weirder problem.
I've been following the case for years. 29-year-old female.
29? He was 13 and she was 29. That means that Sarah was all of 15 years old when Reese knocked her up. 1, ew, and 2, this is clearly not a 15-year-old. Why is this so hard? Buy a calculator and just figure this shit out. These are just numbers, people. They can be changed without mucking up the plot at all. And what about that plot? What's happening 12 years after Judgment Day was stopped? An evil Terminator has come back through time, and a reprogrammed one that looks like Arnie has come back to stop it, her, whatever. How is this different from the last film? Well, it's not as good for one, but the one main difference is that this time the Terminator isn't just looking for John, but for his future associates, including his future wife, Kate Brewster. Of course, once he pops his head up, he gets on her list too, so the difference there is pretty minimal. But the key difference from Part 2 is the absence of Sarah Connor, who rather anticlimactically dies off screen before film 3 begins.
What happened to her?
Leukemia.
Also known as the actress didn't want to return syndrome. Her absence is sorely felt in this film, and it's a shame that they couldn't manage to portray such an emotional moment, as John saying goodbye to her would have been pivotal to his character. It's also a shame that they keep ignoring the films that have come before. What the hell is this thing? The second film described the T-1000 as being
advanced prototype.
How the hell is it a prototype if they already had this even more advanced model in existence? Could the T-1000 make ray guns?
You can't form complex machines.
But this one can. How the hell is Skynet still advancing its technology?
Their defense grid was smashed. We'd won.
Are you sure about that, Kyle? Their R&D department doesn't seem to have slowed down by a hair. And why the hell didn't you tell Sarah another Terminator would be coming in 10 years? Now granted, maybe they didn't discover that until after they'd sent you, but then why didn't the T-800 from the sequel tell Sarah about the T-X? What the hell is going on up there in the future?
Oh dear, I say, General Connor, you better get over here and have a look at this.
What is it, Lieutenant Garfafofafeld?
This might be important.
Well, crap. Part 3 is also where things started to slide tonally, like subsequent installments in slasher series where the once frightening killer starts to become the butt of jokes. The Terminator here feels a lot less intimidating.
Talk to the hand.
In other ways, it signaled a return to the bleaker outlook of the original, as the film ends with the nuclear war occurring after all. But the film never stops to explain how the destruction of Cyberdyne failed to prevent Skynet from happening. Or at least it didn't do so in the final cut. A deleted scene offered this brief exchange.
You do know the patents were obtained from a private vendor, Cyberdyne?
Cyberdyne? It's ancient history.
Just a few seconds was required to explain that the military had already acquired this data from Cyberdyne. But they decided to cut that one little tiny bit out, logic be damned. Of course, the scene also illustrated the fact that the military was already starting to work on actual Terminators before the war even happened.
Infiltrators started to appear. Terminators were the newest, the worst.
Christ, Kyle, we can't believe a single thing you say, can we? Of course, the coming of the nuclear war meant that my hopes for a future war film just might be realized after all. And one did materialize, just not the one I was hoping for. Terminator Salvation might have been better named Terminator Running in Place. Everything about this film is wrong, but the most egregious sin it commits is showing no interest in giving us any kind of finale. This was cynically meant as a film designed to rake in the box office a Terminator film was sure to produce, while leaving as much room for future films as before it started.
This battle has been won, but the war against the machines rages on.
We got nowhere near the destruction of Skynet and the time travel gamut that will loop back to the original and close the series out. Because who wants to do that? You'd have to stop milking the cash cow.
Everybody deserves a second chance.
Why else would we be watching this movie? But again, no one was paying attention. We learned that Skynet is prioritizing John Connor and Kyle Reese.
You're number 2 on the list. Well, who's number 1? Kyle Reese.
Why? It would have no possible way of knowing yet that they would end up being important. John's rise to leadership is in the future. They can't possibly know about it yet. The only Terminator who could have even deduced that Reese was John's father didn't survive to pass on any such intel to its future mainframe, so why would Reese be a target? Why is this so hard? And what's so hard about giving us the future war we'd seen glimpses of in the first 2 films? This looks thrilling, yet nothing like this happens in Salvation. Instead, we get absurdities like this giant robot whose footfalls are terribly loud after it's revealed, but which was apparently able to tiptoe up to the building in the middle of nowhere without being seen or heard. It's clearly in a position to kill or capture everyone here with ease, so most of the scenes of our heroes escaping just frame the robot out of shot so the film doesn't have to explain why this 2-story machine isn't stopping them. Complementing this is John Connor's alleged strategic genius, which sees him broadcasting the news of an impending resistance attack on the core of Skynet the following day to anyone who will listen. Does Skynet not have radio?
We know the machines use shortwave transmitters to communicate.
This is, by the way, the 5th actor to play John Connor, if we count the actor that played him in the television series The Sarah Connor Chronicles. This is, for the record, a terrible way to create audience investment and attachment to a character. Imagine if Tony Stark was played by a different actor in each movie right up until this moment.
And I forget.
One might also forget that Kate Brewster is even in this film, given that she was also recast and does next to nothing. It feels like a character that the writers inherited from the previous film and were thus obliged to include in some way, which is weird because it's the exact same screenwriters that wrote the last film. Now, Anton Yelchin does a fine job at portraying the young Kyle Reese, despite the fact that at no point does he ever
work loading bodies.
I'm starting to think that maybe Reese just made up half of everything he said in the first film. But most of the film's not about him either. Instead, it's about some new guy played by Sam Worthington, a man who donates his body to science and becomes a new kind of Terminator after he was executed for... I'm not really sure. I mean, some people died, but depending on whether he was a drunk driver or a mass-murdering serial killer, I don't know, and therefore I don't know whether or not I'm supposed to forgive him. It was rather cool seeing a perfect recreation of the 1984 T-800 during the battle inside the Skynet core, even though the last film said that
it had spread into millions of computer servers across the planet. There was no system core.
Again, it's like the writers had no idea what the last oh yeah, right. It's the same people that wrote the last film. God damn, why is this so hard? It's altogether ridiculous that this film is so inconsequential that anyone working their way through the series could skip it entirely and miss absolutely nothing. Perhaps that's what inspired the writers of the 5th film to essentially do exactly that. Terminator Genisys begins with a flashback showing Kyle Reese's first meeting with John Connor at a different age and under totally different circumstances than the previous film depicted. Almost as if they were asking us to overlook Salvation completely. Fine, done. What do you got for me? Oh look, it's a new John Connor. I'm starting to think that this character has been played by more actors than any pop culture figure who doesn't wear a mask and stab people. The film begins as Skynet is going down and the human resistance has discovered the time machine. Maybe it's nitpicking, but this army looks entirely too healthy and well fed for a resistance force that was living off of rat in the original film. This is not nitpicking. That photo was lost in a fire before the war was ever won. Has no one here actually watched the first film since 1984? Why is this so hard? Recast Kyle Reese and the Terminator get sent back to 1984, whereupon we see reshot versions of many iconic scenes from the original, all of which manage to be somewhat blander, which kind of feels like an extended metaphor for the series as a whole. Even the bum in the alley whose pants get stolen by Kyle was more interesting the first time around.
That son of a bitch just stole my pants!
That son of a bitch took my pants!
Suddenly, however, things change as an age-accurate Arnold model shows up and definitely changes the course of events. We'll learn he was sent even further back in time to save a young Sarah from a T-1000 that had been sent to kill her in her childhood. How did that not happen the first time around? And who sent the reprogrammed T-800 back as her protector? We don't know that either.
Who sent him back?
Those files have been erased.
Oh, that's convenient.
We actually never end up finding out. This was reportedly meant to be the first film in a new trilogy, but when that didn't happen, those little mysteries that were left behind just went nowhere. Stranger Things was still a year away when this film was released, so the filmmakers elected not to set the rest of the conflict in 1984, which probably would have gone over like gangbusters a year later. To get up to present day, Sarah and her Terminator protector, Pops, have built a time machine of their own. I won't belabor the unlikeliness of this, but I will address a few things regarding the series' specific notion of time travel, specifically the whole
nothing dead will go
issue. They try explaining this by saying that
we've measured the magnetic field. It'll rip apart anything not encased in living tissue.
But unless people are wearing metal underwear up in the future, I don't see why this necessitates them being naked to go through. And like the T-1000 before it, this new nanotech machine that is merged with John Connor seems to be able to time travel without issue. I'd suggest that maybe the Terminators were made of non-magnetic metals, but given that we've seen them trapped twice by large magnets, that's clearly not the case. The other issue, though, is the way the film deals with the fact that Kyle and Sarah have to strip naked and walk into this thing together. It's treated as no big deal when this moment really would have been an avalanche of emotions. Kyle Reese has been in love with Sarah for God knows how long leading up to this moment. This would be so awkward for him, feeling at once excited and also probably embarrassed with a sprinkling of guilt over his own attraction.
One person couldn't feel all that. It'd explode.
Sarah would know that this man is supposedly fated to be the father of her son. She would feel like this guy is almost certainly checking her out, while also being curious knowing that in another timeline she had fallen in love with him. And yet they pretty much just walk up the ramp side by side like it's no big deal, because films these days have gotten so damn timid. And I'm not just saying this because Emilia Clarke is cute. This goes both ways. The film shows us a repeat of the original Terminator's arrival, only now there's a convenient shadow that follows Arnold's backside around just to protect the below 13 crowd from learning what an ass looks like. Apparently the female audience members don't get to have any fun either. While the looming threat of nuclear war ceased to really be a resonant point with the series after the first film, Genesis does update the series' cautionary tone towards technology by making the emergence of Skynet the result of an AI birthed by a program designed to interconnect digital devices.
Genesis does everything. My phone will link to my tablet, will link to my computer, will link to my car. Everything in my life uploaded and online 24/7.
Only a millennial or younger could think that sounded like anything other than pure hell on earth, though I expect the warning will go unheeded as giant corporations like Amazon continue trying to put active microphones in our homes. I'm sure that will never be abused in any way at all. I did enjoy seeing Sarah Connor back in the series, even if portrayed by a different actor, and it's a version of her we've never seen before, having already begun training for the battle to come, but still harboring the resentment of a teen who'd rather be doing almost anything else.
I do not see a choice.
Story of my life.
I really can't say the same for Jai Courtney as Reese. I'm unfamiliar with any of his other work, but I'm sorry to have to say, Jai Courtney, you're no Michael Biehn. That man looked like he'd been through hell, as if he'd never slept more than 10 minutes at a time in his whole life. You could read the hardship he'd endured on his face without him even saying a word. Jai Courtney doesn't look like he's lived through the horrors of even a normal garden variety war, much less the apocalypse. Fortunately, in a way, we were spared his lackluster portrayal of Reese for future installments, as the powers that be decided that the timeline had just become needlessly convoluted, which was true, and decided for the next outing to erase everything after T2 and make a fresh start, if going back to the middle can constitute a start. James Cameron got involved again, Linda Hamilton was back, and there were even whispers of Edward Furlong returning to the series. It seemed like a best-case scenario, but like so many situations when somebody says something like,
I cannot be betrayed,
you just know there's some smug, ironic twist lurking around the corner.
At least things can't get any crazier.
You know this is your fault for saying that.
So, 2 minutes into the film, John Connor, focal point of the series even before his character ever appeared on screen, is shot and killed by another random T-800, even though they supposedly stopped that future, and suddenly the first 2 films, you know, the good ones, are rendered completely moot. We're back in Alien 3 territory, a film that James Cameron described as being, quote, dumb, for killing off Newton Hicks in the title sequence. Bizarrely enough, he now takes total credit for that exact same lousy approach to sequels. So with the return of Cameron and Furlong to the series not quite living up to what we might have hoped, what's left? Well, I will say, Linda Hamilton does a fine job, and for the stupidest possible reason, she does have some emotional scenes of the sort that made the original films rise above typical action fare.
I don't have a photograph of John, but now I'm forgetting his face.
In John's absence, she's reduced to traveling around and dispatching Terminators as they arrive in present day from the future, but thanks to her and John, that future no longer exists. So what does the future hold now that Skynet will never be created? Well, there's this other AI called Legion, which rises, causes a nuclear war, creates Terminators and sends them back in time to take out its enemies, and are you fucking kidding me? That deleted scene from part 3 was a more logical way to continue the series. Killing John off wasn't a way to forge a radically different vision for the franchise. It's literally the exact same plot setup and most of the same plot.
It's called Legion.
Legion?
An AI built for cyber warfare.
Trusted to run it all. They say it got smart.
Day 2, they launched nukes.
Decided our fate in a microsecond. Extermination.
Then Legion started to hunt survivors.
The disposal units ran night and day. We were that close to going out forever.
Someone found me. Saved me.
He turned it around. He brought us back from the brink.
The only difference being that they've swapped out John Connor for Joan Connor. Our new messiah is a girl named Dani who will grow up to lead the fight against Legion, a story identical to the one which was already in progress, but which was rebooted so we could just then get it again. And no, I don't care that the new character is Hispanic and therefore might be part of some criticism against immigration policies. It could be. I don't give a shit. This is the sort of partisanship that the Terminator films, the good ones, were always against.
We're not gonna make it, are we? People, I mean.
It's in your nature to destroy yourselves.
Yeah. Major drag, huh?
Do we really want the Terminator to be right about that? Can we just stop bitching about the scary other for a minute? Christ, these guys can figure it out. What the fuck is our problem? So no, I don't care who they replaced John Connor with. I care that he was replaced at all. If they felt they had to do this in order to take the series in some radical new direction and avoid retreads, I could possibly understand that. But to just do the exact same thing again is baffling. The only reason for the swapping seems to be an inexplicable desire to make the Terminator series into some sort of woman power statement when it was already exactly that. James Cameron was pretty clear about that all along. Dark Fate, a name which seems to have been chosen just to dare detractors to make the obvious joke, also introduces a female to the Kyle Reese role, in a move which makes it seem as though the creators felt the only way for women to be heroic was for all the men to be sort of taken out of the picture. Isn't that kind of insulting? Yes, the Terminators are played by men, but the characters are sexless things. Is it too passé to have the two halves of the human race actually working together?
You are not the mother of some man who saves the future.
Recent films seem to have this bizarre attitude as though in the last couple of years they've magically invented the heroine.
It's coming back in a big fucking way.
Not that heroine, this kind. Not only have new films not pioneered the concept, they've frequently done it worse. T2 actually took the risk of making Sarah Connor downright unlikable for much of the film. She's rather a terrible mother who seems to treat her son like a tool for winning the war more than anything else.
I said it was okay.
And doesn't show him any actual affection until he arrives to try and stop her from blowing a man's brains out in front of his family. She nearly sinks to the level of the Terminator itself, who saw her death as simply a mission to accomplish with no ethical component. When John comes to stop her, she finally remembers why humans are better than machines, and their reconciliation reconciliation allows us to bond with her character all over again. Heroes don't need to be flawless paragons. Those don't exist in real life, and they're not very interesting or relatable for an audience. These people should take a long, hard look at Fury Road, a film which was avowedly about gender conflict and did it brilliantly. There's no speechifying. There's just a situation we're allowed to see unfold and draw our own conclusions about. The characters start off at each other's throats, and by the end are allies who all depend on one another. It's also an amazing action film throughout, the sort of film this one wishes it could be. Tim Miller gave us Deadpool, and nothing can ever take that away from him, but trying to blame this film's lackluster performance on notions that people don't like it just because it's the sixth film is being really lame. Mission Impossible 6 was the most successful film in that franchise, and if you actually felt that way, why did you agree to do this film in the first place?
Take some responsibility.
Such as, give us something new with your sequel. The Terminator Who Comes to Respect Human Life storyline has already been done twice before, and better. Here, the Terminator's journey towards a conscience happens entirely off-screen and is related in a conversation, whereas T2 showed that character arc over the course of the entire film. And don't give us things like major plot convenience, who shows up midway through to give our heroes a weapon and act he admits is treasonous, and never explain who he is. My first thought was that he was supposed to be Miles Dyson's son, which would have fit in perfectly with this opening exchange.
Always good to see you, Major.
It's never good to see you, Connor.
But it's not him, so that part of the story never makes sense. I kind of like the Rev 9, not for the gimmicky, it's a T-1000 and a T-800, but because of its ability to mimic a human personality.
Say, you boys know where I can get my hands on a chopper?
Which would be a great asset for an assassin. Though, if Terminators are meant to be infiltrators, somebody has to explain to me why they don't all look like this. Who would you be more likely to let into your compound? This, or this scary-ass thing that looks terrifying even if it's not a killer robot? And while you're at it, could you explain how John Connor was killed by a Terminator T-800 from a future that now no longer exists? Don't tell me that that Terminator had already been sent back before they changed the future. There's no already to this. The future does not happen before the present. Why is this so fucking hard? The failure of Dark Fate seems, for the time being at least, to have finally killed the franchise, and I'm actually a little sad, because I never did get to see the Terminator sequel that I really wanted to see all along, the one that seemed so damn obvious. If for some reason some crazy people handed me the reins, I know exactly what I'd do. The deleted scene from Part 3 offered a workable reason why the war might still happen. I'd devote the first act of the movie to the early stages of the war and the passing of Sarah Connor, whose death was never realized on screen, and which we know must have happened before the end of the war, otherwise John wouldn't have been needed. She would attempt to take out Skynet again, trying to save her son from the difficult future he has ahead, and die in a heroic way, saving his life one last time. I'd then move forward to the closing stages of the war and center the plot on John's uncertainty as humanity's savior. If his victory is a certainty, there would be no dramatic tension. A first attempt at destroying Skynet would fail badly and leave him shaken. Had being told his entire life that he was destined to be the savior of the human race made him overconfident? Could the once encouraging advice that
the future's not set
just as easily apply to his presumed victory? I would also focus the story on the relationship between John and Reese and on the moral implications of sending his own father to his certain death so that he, John, could exist, especially given that only one of them knows that. I'd probably bring Sarah back for one last scene, like her memory of Reese in the long cut of T2, to give her son some final encouragement as John contemplates prioritizing attack against the time machine once it's located, thus possibly preventing Skynet's Hail Mary play and eliminating the need to sacrifice his father, only to be reminded,
if you don't send Kyle, you can never be.
Unable to reconcile the fact that he's already been born in this timeline with the idea that if he simply does nothing with regards to Reese, he might suddenly at some point spontaneously cease to exist. He determines to try and change the future as his mother once had.
God, a person could go crazy thinking about this.
This would lead to a final Fury Road scale assault on Skynet, with action and character building occurring simultaneously as the original film had done so effectively. The Resistance would capture the time displacement complex just in time to see the original T-800 vanishing in the machine, with a second one preparing to follow. After disabling it, the decision to send someone to intercept it falls to John. Realizing that all surviving Terminators are likely converging on their position to participate in this final ploy, he rejects the notion that they could reprogram the damaged T-800 as a protector, as there's no time to spare. The weight is lifted off his shoulders when, surprisingly, Reese says,
I volunteered.
Meeting Sarah, after all, is what he's always wanted, and he says that he'll gladly
die for John Connor,
as the man has become like a father to him, just to twist that emotional knife a little bit. After he enters the machine, the Resistance prepares to blow up the complex when a discovery is made. With the time being of the essence to Skynet's plans too, it already sent the T-1000 back first. Knowing no human soldier could be a match for this advanced weapon, John orders his men to protect the area until the T-800 can be reprogrammed as suggested. And with that, the circle would be completed. No dumb comedy, no cringy quips, and we'd actually see Terminators that look different from Arnold. That little bit at the end would be the only time we'd see him in the entire movie.
Fuck you, asshole.
Character relationships would take front and center because that's what made the original film work so well. When Sarah was being chased by the Terminator, we weren't hoping she'd escape because we were fretting that, oh no, the future war will be lost. We wanted her to live because we liked her and Kyle, and we wanted them to live. The whole backstory about the war and John and time travel was just to provide a motive for a nearly unstoppable machine to target a random everyday person. That film is compelling in spite of the obvious projection screen effects and stop motion and the fact that you could totally see Arnold's real eye behind those glasses right after we saw him pluck it out. All the money that could be subsequently thrown at the series hasn't raised it above the heights achieved in that first $6.5 million film. All the effects technology in the world hasn't given the later films anything as perfectly illustrative as this pair of shots. Maybe instead of constantly recycling that original film's dialogue in a desperate attempt at reminding us of back when the series was good.
I'll be back. She'll be back. I'm back.
Please, for God's sake, please stop it.
I'll be back.
Stop it!
I'll be back.
Stop it!
I'll be back.
Stop it!
I won't be back.
They should have tried a little bit harder to make those sequels be memorable in their own right. While my idea for how to continue the series will never see the light of day, there is a solution. The newest home release of Terminator 2 has the option of watching it with the original ending, the one that makes sequels a practical impossibility. Do that, and you won't have to face an old nightmare. The war against diminishing returns.
You're so creative.